Well, thank you very much, Linda, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I truly am honored and delighted to be here. I'm also very excited because I learned that this lecture is going to be streaming live on YouTube so that there are people all around the world that are sitting in front of their computer screens watching it. And when I found out, I immediately ran out and called my wife and said, you gotta watch me. I'm going to be on YouTube. So if my wife is watching. The 1980s. That was the decade that the Incinerator Wars came to the south suburbs of Chicago. Energy firms from all corners of the country descended upon the southern portion of Cook County with proposals to build giant trash-burning plants that would convert garbage into saleable steam and electricity. At least 6 suburban municipalities gave the matter serious consideration. Now, the immediate impetus behind this onslaught was a 1981 Illinois law that sought to promote conservation by subsidizing the sale of electricity from facilities that consumed and burned garbage. The resulting entrepreneurial interest in an area known as the Calumet Region bucked a prevailing trend, which was one of capital flight from that region, particularly flight of heavy industry. Now this area, and that you can see Lake Michigan, it's the bottom of Lake Michigan, and all those suburbs on the left are southern Cook County. The region also stretches into northwest Indiana. That region was once a crucible of American industry, but in recent years it had witnessed massive layoffs and plant closings. Ultimately, these incinerator proposals generated more heated debate than heat. Local opposition to the prospect of polluting garbage furnaces was fierce, although by no means universal. And these municipalities, because of the way Illinois law was written, had the right to reject those incinerator initiatives, and most of them did, despite their near-desperate economic straits. There are 2 aspects of these incinerator wars that warrant our attention. First, they contradict the image of blue-collar communities as hapless victims of external forces in the era of deindustrialization. They demonstrate that communities continued to have agency. Secondly, these struggles were important because they had far-reaching consequences. These incinerators were viewed as a solution to a metropolitan-wide problem. And that problem was mounting volumes of consumer waste and no place to put it. Thus, the rejection of the incinerators had implications not just for those communities, but for the entire Chicago area. Now, I understand that you have had speakers from different disciplines come to talk to you about the environment, and I'm a historian, so I wanted to say a little bit about how historians think about the environment and how this subject matter is, to some extent, indicative of that, or exemplary. Historians really began looking into what they call environmental history in the 1970s, and it's become a very strong field since then. And typically what historians do is they look for the roots of contemporary environmental problems. So it could be problems related to pollution, it could be problems related to climate change, it could be problems related to resource use. Historians look to the past to try to explain how we got to the present predicament. In addition, historians also are interested in what lessons we can learn by investigating how previous generations addressed what they considered to be environmental problems at the time. And my talk is going to do a little bit of both. But there's another perspective from which I am tackling my subject matter that I think is less common in environmental history, but perhaps will be more so, and that is to think about places from more of an ecological perspective. I'm an urban historian. I'm interested in cities. I've always been interested in cities. And most historians, when they think about cities, they see a city as kind of a sum of its internal parts. But there's another way to look at cities and the parts of cities in a more ecological way, which is to think about relationships, the way different places relate to one another, the way they connect to one another. And that's what I've been trying to do, and although it may not be explicit, that's one of the perspectives that underlies what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, the larger study that I'm engaged in right now is the question of how cities adapted to the cataclysmic shocks of deindustrialization in the decades after World War II. And I'm getting at this issue by looking at the epicenter of these dislocations, the sprawling zones of heavy industry that arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that ultimately bore the brunt of industrial disinvestment in the 1970s and 1980s. And I'm trying to figure out what happened to these places. How did they respond to the situation? And how did they alter their relationship with other parts of their host metropolis and other parts of the world? And tonight, I'm going to highlight one aspect of that transformation, which was their tighter integration into metropolitan flows of waste material. During the latter part of the 20th century, de-industrializing suburbs became critical nodes in reconfigured garbage networks. They assumed this function in part because the physical infrastructure of manufacturing was very easily retrofitted to accommodate the movement, reprocessing, and disposal of trash. Also, in part, because hard times increased the pressure on them to accept activities that wealthier communities had the luxury of being able to reject. But even with limited maneuverability, local communities continue to shape the outcome of their historical transformations, and by extension, the larger networks in which they were enmeshed. No industrial zones, or no older industrial zones in the United States escaped the debilitating effects of deindustrialization. When we think of deindustrialization, we often think of the Rust Belt. That's probably a term you've heard. People define the geography of the Rust Belt different ways. Sometimes it's the Great Lakes region. Some people are a little bit more generous and talk about it stretching from New England all the way to the Mississippi River, say up north of St. Louis. And clearly, the biggest shocks, the most dramatic economic jolts occurred in that Rust Belt region. But deindustrialization was really a national phenomenon. And the timing, the magnitude may have differed from place to place, but virtually all older manufacturing areas witnessed some aspects of this phenomenon. Fundamentally, deindustrialization represented a crisis of investment that operated on two different levels. The first was the direct impact of a shrinking manufacturing sector. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, plant closings were big news. Factories that had employed 10, 20, 30,000 people were shutting down, leaving, sometimes for other parts of the United States where wages were lower, and increasingly overseas to low-wage countries. This left communities with hulking factory buildings and diminished tax revenues. But despite these news stories, these big news stories, contraction was generally a long-term process. It often did not come with just one big blow, but rather was a series of decisions on the parts of industries to shut down certain operations or transfer certain operations within a plant and downsize workers, often as a precursor to ultimate abandonment. A second aspect is the indirect impact of residential disinvestment due to workforce reductions. And this was a product as much of plant closings and the contraction of production as it was a process of automation, which was the substitution of machine for human labor in factories that was going on at this same time, all part of the same strategy on the part of corporations to reduce their costs. So whether plants were shutting down or whether they were automating, there was less and less industrial work to be found in older manufacturing districts. And as a result, communities grew more impoverished because there were no jobs at equivalent pay levels coming into those communities to replace the jobs that were leaving. Moreover, the families that were able to retain jobs tended to move. Upward mobility in the United States in the 20th century almost always meant moving somewhere. Moving upward meant moving outward. And so the phenomenon that many people have probably heard about of white flight, which is usually thought of as a city to suburb movement, was also a suburb to suburb movement, out of these types of communities into communities that were usually located further from the urban core, leaving poorer communities behind. So I'm going to do something else now that I'm excited about. Oh, these are some of the areas that I'm studying. So this is 6 metropolitan areas I'm going to be focusing on, and these are some of the towns in those areas. Probably most of them you've never heard of. A few of them you probably had. Now, since we are fairly close to Chicago, I'm going to try to give you as many Chicago examples today, but I may say a few things about some of these other places. Okay, so another thing I'm very excited about, I just recently learned how to make graphs. And it's very easy to do in Excel, but I've been using Excel for years, but I just learned that you can make graphs automatically. So whenever I can now, I try to insert as many graphs into my talks. So I'm very, very proud of these. So here's a few to give you an idea with some selected suburbs of the trends. And here you see in the 60s were pretty good times for the economy, for the industrial economy. Wages generally went up in most places, not everywhere. And then you see from 1980 to 2000 steep drops. Some of the poor communities that were poorer to begin with, the drop is less steep. And again, the timing is different in different places, but that gives you an idea of kind of the range of temporal trends. The timing almost all of them end up lower than in 2000 than where they were in 1980. Okay. So this impoverishment of these communities had serious repercussions for the built environment and the social environment of these communities. Governments were bringing in revenue. They had trouble maintaining facilities, maintaining streets, basic services, and there was just a general decay that was going on. So a central dilemma that faced all these communities was what to do with this decaying physical environment, an environment that was being abandoned, an environment that had been created in the first place to accommodate the needs of manufacturers. What were they going to do with this at a time when manufacturers were leaving? The central features of these environments were large factory complexes, rudimentary housing, transportation infrastructures designed for freight movement, and hazardous waste residue in the form of slag heaps, contaminated soils, and riverbeds, polluted riverbeds. So how to repurpose these properties for a viable post-industrial use was a question that came to vex de-industrialized suburbs for decades. As it turned out, the housing issue turned out to be the easiest one to solve. There was a general decline in population, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. But one of the things you'll notice in several of these places, population began to recover, or at least leveled off, as you approached 2000. And the reason for that is while there was considerable flight, toward the very end of the century, there were new populations that were coming in. these were generally populations of color, thus changing the complexion of these suburbs. So, and here we see very dramatically percentage of white residents plummets most of these places. Question of how to fill abandoned industrial property was a tougher one. Now, once local governments recognized that deindustrialization represented a permanent restructuring of the U.S. economy, it was not just a little temporary blip, which was what they did think at first, because it was the most convenient thing to think. But once they realized that the industries are not coming back, they often tried to reinvent themselves. Reinvent themselves as tourist destinations, retail hubs, upscale residential districts, and other activities connected to the most vital sectors of the post-industrial economy. But there were powerful factors working against them. One thing was an image problem. People thought of these places as gritty, working-class industrial towns and had trouble thinking about them as something different. Populations there tended not to have the skill sets to draw information sector businesses that were in the vanguard of the new economy. They typically were not near universities that were among the big sources of innovation in the new knowledge economy. And they typically didn't enjoy the type of amenities that attracted what's now called the creative class. On top of all of that was the problem of garbage or waste, particularly contaminated industrial waste. Because when the factories left, they didn't take all that crap that they had left on the ground and dumped into the rivers with them. They left it there. And for the communities, this was particularly unfortunate because it coincided with the rise of a very powerful environmental movement, which led to the creation of laws that mandated that those wastes be cleaned up. An important law was passed in 1980. And I always get it wrong, so I'm not even going to try to say the name, but it goes by the acronym CERCLA. C-E-R-C-L-A. Comprehensive Environmental Liability. I don't remember what, I got stuck after that. Okay, but the important thing about this, ever hear the Superfund? That name ring a bell? This was the law that created Superfund. The Superfund was a superfund that would clean up the most hazardous waste sites. But it wasn't that super. It couldn't cover more than a few dozen. So the other thing that this law did was had provisions to track down those who were responsible for the pollution and make them pay. The problem with this law was that it assigned liability very broadly. So anybody who ever set foot or put their finger on the property, potentially, if so you were involved in that property, you've got to pay for the cleanup. Well, imagine what the effect of that was on potential investors. Nobody wanted to touch these properties because who knows what had been dumped there, who knows what might be found later, who knows what they might be held responsible for. So this law, with its good intentions, actually just froze the market for industrial real estate in these communities. Nobody wanted to come in and buy. To some extent, once EPA saw what was happening, there were some efforts to redress this problem. One of the things that they did was they started an initiative that states did as well, is known as Brownfields Initiative. Anybody ever heard of that term? It's a set of policies that were established beginning more or less in the 1990s, where agreements would be worked out to potential investors, saying to them, we know you're afraid that you're going to be assigned liability, so we'll make a deal with you. We'll cut a deal with you. If you agree to clean up the property to a certain level, we'll hold you harmless for any liability. Now, these cleanups could run astronomically high figures. So what these deals consisted of was generally partial cleanups in order to entice people to invest. However, there was a condition. A partial cleanup also meant there were limitations on what you could do with that property once you purchased it and redeveloped it. Typically, the conditions were, if it's partial cleanup, you're leaving some stuff there. We don't want kids playing there. We don't want a lot of human activity there. So you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this and the other. That left them with few options on how to redevelop. And so brownfields, while it helped, still put a lot of these communities in a bind. So if the physical remains of industrial production and other attributes of place foreclosed certain redevelopment paths, they nonetheless worked to the advantage of at least one lucrative activity that flourished in the post-industrial economy, and that was the handling of regional waste matter. Indeed, these communities came to be seen as solutions to a national garbage crisis that was, by this time, several decades in the making. So let me briefly explain the garbage crisis. Problem had its roots in the post-World War II period, when America became what was known as a throwaway society. This was an era of rampant consumerism, when success was defined by the purchases that you made. People were moving to the suburbs, out of the inner cities, so they had much more space to buy things, to fill up their homes and to show off to their neighbors that they had the latest TV set, they had the latest refrigerator, they had the latest furniture set. Well, more consumer possessions also meant more stuff to throw out. And so along with increases in consumption came increases in garbage. These mounting volumes of trash posed a problem because the local municipalities who had responsibility for garbage collection and disposal couldn't handle it. They weren't set up to dump all this stuff. Every town back in this era had a dump, the town dump. These were not huge places. And by the 1950s, 1960s, they were running out of room. On top of that, here again the environmental movement comes into play. in ways that are often unintended. Stricter environmental laws controlling waste meant that anybody that handled waste, collected it, disposed it, now had to conform to new regulations to ensure that that trash would not be disposed of improperly. And what did this mean? Higher costs. It became more expensive to dispose of waste. So on the one hand, the municipalities, the towns, the suburbs, they're running out of room. On the other hand, they can't afford to open new dumps. It's too expensive for them now. So what do? I have to look at my notes to find out. Well, one thing was encourage recycling. Big kick for recycling, 1960s, really, especially in the 1970s. Bottle bills. You know what bottle bills are? No, nobody knows what a bottle bill is. You used to just, you don't even probably know what bottles are. Well, back in the day, when we used to drink soda and beer, it was in glass bottles. And you just throw them, chuck them out the car window. Just put them in the trash. Just joking. So this was a waste. These were filling up landfills. So they encouraged recycling by paying you a nickel if you returned your glass bottle. That's what a bottle bill was. So that was one example. So that was one solution, encourage recycling. Second, for the towns that couldn't afford it, just give it up. Turn it over to a private company. And that's what was done all over the country, the privatization of garbage collection and disposal. There had always been some element of private business doing garbage collection, but it really increased dramatically in this period. As garbage collection and disposal became privatized, and people began to see this not as a civic responsibility, but as a way to make money, and as garbage handling became a more specialized affair, that meant an opportunity for even more money making. And so what privatization ultimately produced was consolidation, because it was very efficient and hard to make money if every town had their own little garbage collection operation. But the way you could make money was by consolidating. Take 10 towns, have all the garbage collected, and taken to the same place to dispose. And so over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you got to the point where there's less and less outfits collecting garbage until it comes down to 4, and now I think it's 2. I think it's just 2. I don't really know what goes on in the present because I'm a historian. But it's huge conglomerate corporations taking over the business of garbage, and as a result, centralizing the process of disposal. So instead of a metropolitan area having 70, 80, 90 dumps, you have 15 or 20. But where to put them? Where to put those 15, 20? Well, the idea that grabbed most of these corporations, as well as the planners, was that industrial suburbs were the best place to locate these. So that's what they attempted to do. Now, why did they think that these places were ideal? Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that in industrial areas you could combine both industrial wastes with consumer wastes and have an even bigger amount of material to work with and make money. And volume was, again, was a key to making money. In fact, industrial waste are by twice, at least twice as much industrial waste was produced as consumer waste. There's a lot of business in industrial. And industrial, as well as residents are spread evenly around the metropolis, industries tended to be concentrated in these districts, in the suburbs. So that was an ideal place. And so what you saw was a convergence of industrial and consumer waste streams coming together in these areas. Now, paradoxically, this convergence of industrial and consumer waste in these inner-tier metropolitan zones was due to both the disappearance and the persistence of manufacturing. Okay? On the one hand, factory closings opened space that was available, and all those brownfield regulations that you don't want human activity because it might be garbage is fine. That was fine. On the other hand, these districts were never completely emptied of manufacturing. And the ones that stayed, the companies that stayed, provided a market for certain kinds of recoverable wastes. And in addition, they offered their own voluminous streams of waste that could be disposed alongside household refuse. Now, what was the effect, you may be wondering, of this demographic transition that was going on in these communities at the same time? How did that play into it? Well, to some extent, the demographic changes plus the economic distress of these communities played into the hands of garbage entrepreneurs. Yet there are a few things I want to point out. First is that the critical steps in the crystallization of what I'm calling suburban junkyard economies occurred actually before the full effects of deindustrialization were felt or acknowledged, and before these demographic transitions occurred. And in fact, suburban localities maintained an uneasy and conflicted relationship with waste management regimes across economic fluctuations, demographic transitions, and shifting environmental sensibilities. So there was not as big a shift in community reaction to garbage across these years as you might think. So I'm going to try to, oh my goodness, the time, where's the time gone? All right, very quickly, this is going to be like speed. We're coming back to the Calumet region for an example of how this took place. One of the things that was, and here's an early example of how manufacturing and production abandonment could lead to waste disposal. There are a lot of quarries in this area. There's a lot of stone and sand mining, usually in conjunction with kilns and small manufacturing operations, and they were among the first to leave. And these were perfect. These are perfect for dumping garbage. You got a hole waiting for you. So these were the most coveted locations, and we were swooped up by people who thought they could make money doing this. Second, highways. Only 10, 20 years earlier, these were remote areas. You know, to get from Chicago Heights to downtown Gary would take you forever. But Interstate Highway Act, highways were being built. All of a sudden, these got highways crisscrossing them all over the place, perfect for a business where transportation is a significant cost. Okay? Thirdly, lots of industrial zoned land. Most places had laws that if you were going to dump garbage, it had to be in land that was zoned industrial, and these areas had lots of it. And finally, receptive host communities. Almost every time, a dumper wanted to come in to these places, neighbors objected. It was surprising to me to see back in the 1960s, almost always some community group of citizens said, we don't want to dump in our town. But there were also countervailing views where people thought that this was a good thing, and particularly because they thought it would bring undeveloped land into development. You got a quarry, what are we going to do with a quarry? You fill it up with garbage, flatten it out, we can put a shopping center there. Wouldn't that be nice to have a shopping center just a block away? People like that idea. So it was a mixed response, but there was enough of a plus to many of these communities that many of them said, okay, we'll take the dump. And so ultimately, that's where many of them located. This is the CID landfill in Calumet City, biggest dump in the area, still operating. It's a good example. Old dumps might be 10 acres, 12 acres. This is 200-acre tract of land, takes garbage from all over the metropolitan area, hazardous waste, industrial waste, consumer waste. You throw it, we'll take it. Okay? Now, other parts of the country, same thing was happening, except not so much on the East Coast, because these industrial areas, older industrial areas, are just too dense, too built up. No quarries, not many quarries, not enough land to have a dump. But something changes. 1979, what happened in 1979? What was the big environmental event of 1979? Anybody know? Yes, Love Canal. Love Canal. Everybody know Love Canal? Nobody knows it. Love Canal, big story in Niagara, New York. Industrial waste had been dumped, was found to be contaminated. The neighbors rose up, brought to the nation's attention the issue of pollution from dumped waste matter. And now people were like, whoa. Before, when they objected to the dumps, it smells bad. But now it's like, it's going to give me cancer. And that's a big difference. So we see a huge change in public opinion, huge change against landfills. So what it looked like everybody, the city leaders, county planners, we've solved this problem. We just need to put the landfills down. Now everybody's rejecting landfills. What do? No. Incineration. That was the next stage. Incineration, we'll just burn it. Incineration offered another advantage, is because you could go to areas that you couldn't go to with landfills, because they didn't take up as much room. So you could go to dense areas. So on the East Coast, you now started having these incinerator wars, just like you were having in Chicago and out in the West Coast. Long story short, didn't take long before people said, whoa, whoa, whoa. There could be dioxin coming out of those stacks. And then the tide turned against incinerators. What are we going to do? No incinerators, no landfills. What are we going to do with all this garbage? Two factors changed the playing field in late 1990s. One, series of court decisions that made it easier for companies to transport garbage across state lines. That's number one. Number two, consolidation has taken its full effect, where there's just 3 mega companies dealing with garbage. What this allowed them to do, which they couldn't do before, was say, we're just going to build these You thought those were super dumps? These are super, super duper dumps way out in the cornfields, and we'll just put all the dumps there. So Chicago starts sending all of its garbage to rural Indiana. Okay? But does that mean garbage disappears from the landscapes of these places? No. Because what they have to do to make this economical is set up what are known as transfer stations, where the garbage can be collected locally and then moved from short distance to long distance trucks. So transfer stations start appearing on the sites of the old waste dumps. And this is a map that shows you that. We can take a look at it later because I know we're running out of time. All right, so this is the story of how garbage economies come to these suburban districts. The second part of the story, and I'm just going to go through this in 2 minutes, is resource recovery, recycling becoming a big business, and that's the other stream of waste that starts coming into these areas. There always has been a certain amount of consumer garbage that didn't get picked up by the garbage truck, but instead went to the junk dealer. And that amount that was going to get recycled rose in the 1980s and 1990s. Best example of this is the automobile. Okay, I'll skip that. Automobiles were seen as a huge problem because, like other consumer goods, they were being produced faster than people could, and that made people throw them out more, and they were like littering highways everywhere. Junkyards had them piling up, had to get rid of them. So there was this great invention called the auto shredder, which for the first time made it very economical to tear up apart and get the steel, the scrap steel, to steel mills who could use it in their furnaces. And so these auto shredders, where did they locate? Near their source, near their customers, the steel mills. And so you had this gravitation of these auto dismantlers, scrap yards, auto shredders coming into these districts. So that was another dynamic that played into the creation of these junkyard economies on the metropolitan fringe. Okay. And by the way, these encountered much less opposition than the landfills. Because for one thing, they were not considered the responsibility of municipal governments, so they were not regulated to the same extent. You didn't have the same kind of permits that you would need for municipal waste. Secondly, they tended to be on sites that were already used for industrial purposes or had been used for industrial purposes. So these types of places tended to go under the radar. So how pervasive were these activities? I'm going to go over some very interesting slides. We'll stay on that for a second. Well, all these industrial zones saw an increase in these types of activities. They could vary from one place to another. All total, they didn't come close to replacing the economic value of the industries that had left. They tended not to employ a lot of people, maybe dozens or 100 compared to the thousands that a heavy manufacturer would employ. They didn't have the same kind of multiplier effects. And so most communities, they were not the solution to their economic woes. And some communities, for one reason or another, didn't even have these types of outfits coming in. One of them was a little town called Central Falls just outside Providence, Rhode Island, tried desperately to get an incinerator. And you always have a few towns, a few suburbs that were so desperate for some kind of economic development, they would take what other towns didn't want. And Central Falls really wanted an incinerator. They thought it would really boost their local economy, which was flailing. They weren't able to get it because nobody else in Rhode Island wanted incinerators, and so they passed a law banning incinerators in the whole state. Okay? So what did they do? They turned to another booming industry in the late 20th and early 21st century? Prisons. Another perfect reuse of an old factory. And not just in Central Falls, but other places. That was another growth industry that was seen as compatible with former industrial uses and perhaps an economic boost to the economy. Private prisons epitomized a social warehousing economy that, like the garbage economy, channeled society's unwanted byproducts through an underutilized manufacturing infrastructure. And it wasn't just prisoners through which profits could be extracted. The availability of federal subsidies for housing and medical care persuaded local entrepreneurs in this town of Central Falls to convert derelict textile mills and dilapidated three-decker tenements into nursing homes and Section 8 rental units. Still, these developments were unable to reverse the town's economic spiral in this little, I think it's the smallest, it might be the smallest municipality in the United States. But it was all over the newspapers in 2011 because it was one of the first towns in the United States to declare bankruptcy. It had just completely run out of money. And this is the type of situation that many of these places found themselves in at the dawn of the 21st century. Series of corruption scandals raged through the suburban towns running along the Los Angeles River, just southeast of Los Angeles. Towns like Ford Heights, south of Chicago, East St. Louis had poverty rates that were just mind-boggling, approaching 50%. 50% of the population living in poverty. Tucked out of the way, depleted of population in many cases, permeated with crumbling homes, empty factories, salvage yards, prisons, rehab centers, nursing homes, landfills. It's easy to write off these places as tragic but marginal and unimportant. And if I want to leave you with one message tonight, it is that these places are important and they do matter. As solutions to America's garbage crisis, they have allowed us to maintain some of the highest rates of resource consumption in the world, even as recycling has increased somewhat. As warehouses for unproductive humans, they have sustained and exacerbated pernicious inequalities of race and wealth in the United States. These places matter because they are embedded in wider processes that define our relationships with nature and our relationships with each other. And if these places are often out of sight, out of mind, like the garbage that flows through them, episodes like the recent Ferguson uprising near where I live remind us that they don't always remain in the shadows. Thanks.
Let's take questions for about 15 minutes. Just to let you know, we also have a reception upstairs, and there will be a chance to speak with our visitor up there if you want to talk one-on-one. So upstairs in the fireplace lounge, but let's take questions for about 15 minutes. And if you could, please use the microphone. Don't worry that you're going to be broadcast. It's just for the live streaming. So feel free to ask a question. And could we see, first of all, Christy wants to ask the second question. Do we have anybody in the audience who's actually worked in one of these industries? We actually have one of these shredders not far from us. in South Beloit. Our class visited it. It was fascinating. The Bear Industries shredder, and had a first-hand view of some of the recycling work that they do. But is there anybody from the community that would like to make a point, ask a question? Okay, then we'll let Christy dive in.
Thanks. I was wondering, it sounds like a lot of the problems started with the Superfunds. And if you could go back in time and propose a better solution than Superfunds, how might communities have addressed the issues of these abandoned, deindustrialized spaces to be better used to avert some of the problems that happen afterwards?
Yeah. Well, I hate these questions, but I think, you know, the general answer is that you got to change the playing field, and that's one of the things that has really come through to me, and I'm not sure it communicated it that well. It came out in the talk, but sometimes just little changes, just one change in the law, one new policy, one court ruling can have tremendous effects and change the justice of a situation as well as, you know, the geography of a situation. So I think if I was the king of the world, there would be some mechanism so that the communities that received these wastes were compensated in a way that enabled them to turn their communities around. It's not making it a burden, but it's just the opposite.
You mentioned compensation. I've been thinking about Tesla Motors, which won the prize in Reno, Nevada, that gave away a lot of incentives for them to put up a battery plant. And that, you know, that in 20, 25 years, they will pack up and leave. It'll be gone. I'm wondering what the history is of communities looking ahead that drew in industries. I don't know about the garbage industry, but at least just even what seemed to be legitimate manufacturing, and then got stuck with the remains once the companies packed out. Is there a history of any kind of compensation to those communities that they bonded anything with the industries that packed out? It seems like the waste is privatized and the cleaning it up has to be done by the public.
Right. I don't. If there are, they're rare and few and far between. I mean, sometimes they'll offer, if they're opening a new plant, to workers, oh, you can move to our new location, but that's often not practical to do. So, no, and the interesting thing, maybe the ironic thing about it is often those communities are beneficiaries of that plant leaving some other town and usually further east. You know, this is a cycle. This is not just a phenomenon of the 1970s and 1980s. It was there was a compression in those years that made it quite evident. But you had, you know, the textile manufacturing leaving New England in the 1920s and moving to some of these places that were growing in the Midwest. But the answer to your question is no. I don't. I think most of these communities were really shocked when these plants left, even though they shouldn't have been. So there were no provisions.
I actually want to speak to that a little bit because I'm from one of those New England towns where the textile mills moved out, and there were successive waves of industry that were in this town and then moved out. But after the textile mills moved out, the government did have provisions for those companies to compensate the workers, primarily because the workers at that time were young women. So the companies essentially had responsibilities in loco parentis to make sure those young women had a future, which at the time meant making sure they get married. So obviously that's not a good solution for today, but so in former times there were provisions for compensation, and I'm wondering, do you have any ideas of why that didn't happen this time?
I think it was very telling that it was done for women. And that gets into gets to the cultural norms about gender and this kind of paternalistic expectation that you don't do something like that to women, but you can do that to men because, they're rugged individuals and they can take care of themselves. So there's not that same set of expectations.
Yeah, so I had a question on one of your earlier slides. When you showed all the different cities that had the money leaving and the population leaving and the white people leaving, there was one city in particular that seemed to have bucked that trend. I think it was San Pablo, maybe it was San Pedro.
San Pablo.
San Pablo.
Yes.
What was that city's story, and are there any lessons that can be learned from it?
Yes, be close to San Francisco. That's the lesson. San Francisco is an anomaly. San Pablo is really interesting. There's a lot of poverty there. But the reason that the median income doesn't show the same trends is because there's also a lot of wealth in the air that's flowing out of this dynamic San Francisco information economy spilling over into that's Contra Costa County. So that's the reason.
I actually am from San Pablo
No
and
kidding.
Richmond area. The one thing too that I think had also boosted the economy in the late 90s was the opening of Casino San Pablo.
Yeah.
So their gaming in the late 90s, something had happened. I'd moved out of the area at that time, but something had happened so that casinos were starting to open up a lot more in the San Francisco Bay Area. It used to be you'd go off to Reno and Lake Tahoe to do your gambling, but by the late 90s, early 2000s, you were starting to see Ohlone Indians opening up local casinos. So that was part of that trend. Yeah. But the interesting thing about that area too is that although it's the San Francisco Bay Area, Cal Berkeley is in that area as well, there are still pockets that people will not go to of Richmond and San Pablo. Oh, yeah. It's funny when I tell people I'm from Richmond, they'd say either I was mugged in Richmond or my car was stolen and it was found in Richmond. Yeah. And now with your explanation of these scrapyards, it kind of makes sense maybe of why they would find their cars in Richmond.
Yeah.
But gaming was something that sort of boosted the local economy.
Yeah, and that was a strategy that was also widely employed by a lot of these places.
Could you talk a little bit about other countries that are more successful at this? And I just wanted to make one other comment on this. I know a number of elderly people that are land stewards in rural areas, and these are some of the most intelligent, well-informed people in terms of what's happening in junkyards, and really very cognizant of the way that waste is being, handled in the big cities, right? People who really do know that there are, numerous railroad cars, for example, leaving Chicago all the time with garbage, right? And they see that. Mm-hmm. So that there are groups of people that I think are very aware of this, but on the large scale, I think that we're pretty undereducated in terms of the, massiveness. Mm-hmm. So my question was, do you see a country that has a better approach than we do?
I don't know if it's better, but Japan
Right.
is an example that does it very differently. And they actually mandate, they have a policy that you dump your garbage where you live. So it has remained decentralized. And so every community has their own garbage, so they got to deal with it. So on the one hand, it's a less efficient system, but it does not allow you to say it's somebody else's problem.
I actually have a question too. In looking at this final graph, this supports one of my soapbox issues, and that is the huge increase, that gray area, which I can see from here, is construction materials. And it strikes me in the United States, we've gone from throwing away bottles to throwing away buildings and throwing away land. And that's part of our ethos. There's always more somewhere else. How much of that construction waste, construction materials can be managed in a different way? Is there a way to revise the way we dispose of buildings? Build a new suburb, live there for 20 years, and then, well, it's going to fall down anyway. So I just wondered if construction materials in particular warrant a different kind of approach.
Yeah, I'm not a policy person, so I could tell you what happened, but I'm not enmeshed enough in the nitty-gritty of that to give you an intelligent answer. No, this is by I think this is by weight. Is that right? Yeah. So keep that in mind. It's not volume. So construction materials may be heavier than, say, plastics. So just that may be why, that's part of the reason why that's such a big area of the graph.
Could you talk a little bit about the sources, the records that you use for your research?
Yeah, and then we'll get to you. I'm sorry, you should be the one that calling on people. The records, yeah, some of the most, I hate to give this secret away because I don't think anybody else knows about it. One of the greatest sources of information is EPA files on industries that are under their purview. They've got, because when they have responsibility for regulating a site, they do tons of research on the background, on the history of that site. And they've got it in their files. And it's not available to the public. You can't just walk in, but you can write them a FOIA request and say, I want to look at your files for this site, this, and it drives them crazy because they're not used to that, but they're obligated to try to serve you. That's really one of the most remarkable sources of information about a lot of these places.
I was wondering, well, thank you first for speaking. I really appreciated what you had to say. And secondly, I was wondering if in your research you found anything, I think along with the American culture of a need for the latest and greatest, there's also blame to be had by industries, obviously, as you point out, particularly for not making quality products. I know that in the early 2000s, Apple came under fire for one of their first models of iPod for it being very defective early on. And I was wondering if, I think it's called consumer obsolescence, where there's products that are
Well, there's planned
ill-equipped.
obsolescence, which
Oh,
is
okay.
you want your products to be disposed of.
Right.
You want people to only have them for a few years, so that they have to buy more.
And
Which
so
means you're throwing out things more frequently.
have you found any pressure or for those industries to make more quality, longer lasting?
That's the one. I mean, if you talk about a policy that needs to be in place, that's the one thing we haven't done is put the responsibility back on the manufacturers of products to take those costs of disposal into account. I mean, there have been some, and small initiatives to do that, but that's where there's a lot of room.
That's our 15 minutes for questions. So like I say, please join us for the reception upstairs and thank Professor Hurley.